Hey everyone, in this video I'm going to talk about how do you ace a data scientist case interviews. As some of you might have encountered before, data science case interviews can be very tricky because one, it's often open-ended and it's business specific. So unless you have actually worked for the company, it's a little bit confusing in terms of how you're going to actually approach it. And more often than not, when a candidate tries to approach this problem, they end up rambling, which is penalizing when it comes to actually providing an effective response. So I'll provide some comprehensive details that are going to be really helpful in a series of videos in this section. So the topics we're going to cover are 5 things. 1, we're going to go over what is a data science case problem. I'll provide some response framework in terms of providing an effective response. I'll also provide some insight scoop in terms of how an interviewer actually evaluates your case response. I'll talk about some preparation strategy that can be really helpful. And lastly, we'll go through some interactive exercise based on a case problem that Lyft has asked in a phone screening. Let's review what a data science case problem is. A data science case problem is nothing more than just an open-ended problem based on a real-life data science project. And what that basically means is that this is a type of problem that a data scientist in the company that you're interviewing for has actually worked on it before for a particular business case. And they just happen to convert this into an actual interview question to see how a candidate would approach these ambiguous type of business problems. Now, there are a couple of characteristics to know about these type of problems. The first of all, it usually starts with one opening question, and it's often very vague. And then there are some 1 to 3 follow-up questions where the interviewer is going to interject saying, hey, I noticed that you said this, can you clarify? Or there might be basically some follow-up questions that have already been created before the interview, and basically it's just one set of multiple questions. Now, another thing to note is that in terms of the duration of this type of problem, it takes about 10 to 20 minutes to solve. That's just because this is open-ended, and it's often in a dialogue format, and so it can take that much amount of time. The third thing is that in terms of the type of topics that are covered, it can be on statistics, machine learning, A/B testing, and product sense. And the last thing I want to note is that the type of domain that the problem is based on, it's usually based on 3 attributes: the company you're interviewing for, the team, and the role. And what that basically means is that as a candidate, if you're going to preemptively prepare for these case interviews, you really want to think about what is the company, what is the team, and what is the role I'm interviewing for. And that's going to help you do a lot of these research that are required in order to do well in the case interviews. Now, the next thing that we're going to take a look at are some examples. So there are 2 examples that I want to provide. And the first one being from the machine learning scientist role in the product demand team at Amazon. An example question could be, how would you build a forecasting system that predicts product sales? Another example could be product scientist's role in the marketing team at Apple. And the question could be, how would you find meaningful segmentations of Apple's customers? Notice how the type of case questions that are asked for each role, it's very relevant. So for instance, when you're building forecasting system, it's a machine learning problem. It's something that a machine learning scientist in the product demand would probably work on. When you're doing segmentation problem for the marketing team, it makes sense because a data scientist and marketing team, they do A/B testing, they do product sense, they do clustering, those sort of things as a way to understand their users. As I mentioned before, really in terms of the company, the team, and the role, highly define the type of case problems that you're going to be asked. Now, in this section, I want to talk about how do you provide a response effectively. More often than not, candidates get confused. They start rambling because they don't know how to approach the problem. So this is where having some framework is going to be incredibly helpful. Now, there are 5 steps I like to cover. First, you want to clarify. Then you want to constrain it. You want to plan it. You want to provide a method. And then you want to conclude it. Now, I just want to let you know that you do not necessarily have to follow all of these steps end to end. Depending on the type of problem that are asked to you, You need to be a bit flexible and modify the procedure as you see fit. But in general, you can apply this framework in pretty much most of the case problems that are asked to you. So let's take a look at a couple examples in terms of how you actually provide this. So I'm going to bring back an example question that was asked. How would you find meaningful segmentations of Apple's customers? The very first thing that you want to do is clarify the question that are being asked to you. So you may want to ask something on the lines of what is business objective of the segmentation? Is it application for product research or marketing? Another question you could potentially ask is, should I focus on customers across Apple's businesses or within a specific business such as Apple Pay or Apple Music? What are the main key characteristics about these questions? Well, if we go back to the original question that was asked, the question is finding meaningful segmentations of Apple's customers. First of all, what does it mean to be meaningful? Depending on the business that you're consulting, meaningfulness can be different things. And when we're saying segmenting, which subpopulation of Apple's customers are we talking about? Are we talking about segmenting across all of the Apple's customers or customers within a particular business? Because we have to keep in mind that Apple is a conglomeration of multiple products, services, and businesses. And so we may not necessarily want to apply the segmentation strategy across all of the Apple customers as a whole. Maybe there's a particular focus, maybe there's a particular business that we want to focus on, and within this type of business, we want to segment the users. So asking these questions as a way to establish the parameter helps you with two things. First of all, it helps you demonstrate to the interviewer that you know how to turn a vague problem into a very constrained, specific objective. The second thing is that it helps you really refine, establish some parameter around what you're going to explore and what you're not going to explore. And that is a very efficient strategy in terms of coming up with some response that are going to be helpful to you. So the next step is constraining. So this is the part after you have gathered some initial clarifying questions, your assumptions have been clarified and those sort of things, it is time for you to constrain this open-ended vague problem into a specific thesis. So you can say something on the lines of, based on your clarifications, I'll focus on segmenting users based on subscription services such as Apple Music, Apple TV Plus, iCloud. The purpose is to help Apple's marketing team create customer profiles that can help them perform target marketing. So notice how the response is really to try to refine things as you go along. And that's what this constraint step is supposed to help you with. Now, keep in mind that you do not necessarily have to jump to this step right off the bat. You can skip this. And there are situations where you may not know how to respond, what your thesis is going to be from the get-go, and that is okay. And this is really where the next part comes in. So the next step is to actually plan things out. And so you may want to take a minute or two to frame your response. So if you have a sheet of paper or journal or Word doc, create an outline in terms of what your solution, what your methodology could be. And so you can just tell the interviewer saying, hey, I need a minute or two to really gather my thoughts. Is that okay with you? And then once you're done, you can resume by saying, to address this problem, I'd like to cover X, Y, Z. And in this case, you can say something along the lines of data preparation, statistical method, and business recommendation. The next step I want to cover is a methodology part. So this is where now you have brainstormed what your methodology is going to be. This is where you explain your solution out loud. So the very first thing I mentioned is that you want to cover the data preparation, at least for this particular question. And so this is the part where you say, hey, so first I need to prepare data that are useful for segmentations. I could use user profile, user behavior, and marketing engagement data. So that's good that you're going to talk about this data. And this is the part where the interviewer might interject and say, hey, what kind of signals could you potentially extract from this? And you might want to elaborate this a bit more. But you're at least establishing the initial framework in terms of how you're going to actually solve this problem. The next thing that you want to dive into is the statistical methodology itself. So how are you going to convert this data into an actual insight by plugging into some statistical methodology? In this case, it's going to be clustering. So you can say something along the lines of, next, I'll apply feature engineering to extract the useful signals. For instance, I could extract the number of active sessions per user in Apple Music in the past 30 days. I can repeat the feature engineering on other subscription services. Such signals can help create what types of services a user typically uses. So notice how here in this response, it talks about basically some strategy in terms of how you would convert this raw data into an actual signals that can be consumable in an actual clustering algorithm. And there's an actual example in terms of what that signal could be. And in this case, it's going to be the number of active sessions. And so you're providing some specific illustrations in terms of what kind of signals that are going to be helpful. And lastly, you want to complete this methodology by saying, here's the algorithm that I'm going to be using. And in this case, the example response is, with the features identified, I can apply clustering algorithms such as k-means. I can use the elbow technique to find the optimal number of clusters. Finally, I can interpret each cluster using descriptive statistics to create user profiles. So basically, you have established your data, you know where your signals are, and now this is a turn where you think about what is the algorithm that you would use to extract your segmentation. In this case, the solution that is approached is basically the clustering algorithm. So the last part is to tie what you have said so far back to the business statement. So this is really the so what part of your response. So you can say something along the lines of, with the clusters identified, I can provide a description of each cluster type. For instance, if a cluster contains users with low frequency active sessions across Apple's customers, the marketing team could send a targeted email campaign to encourage users to stay engaged on the services. So notice how in this example response, you don't just say, okay, let's just use clustering algorithm, we get the clusters, and then we're done. Well, how do you actually use the cluster to find something that is meaningful? And in this case, what is meaningful is something that is impactful for the marketing team. Well, what does the marketing team typically do? They send out emails to get users to be engaged and those sort of things, right? And so if you can find clusters and then apply some descriptive statistics, and then you notice that there are a cohort of users that are low engaged, that are low on the engagement, then maybe this is an opportunity for the marketing team to target these users to improve engagement. Now that is meaningful. So as you can see, a case problem is not just you just spit out some random methodology and those sort of things. There's a very structure in terms of how you respond to this. And I just want to mention that these 5 steps do not cover every solution in terms of how you're going to approach various case problems. But what I want to emphasize is that in general, you do want to think about it in terms of framework. You want to think about how you're going to convert this open-ended vague problem into a structured manner. So hopefully this is really helpful in terms of creating an effective response to case interviews. Now, I want to talk about how interviewer will typically evaluate a case interview. And this is going to be really helpful as a candidate because the more you understand the game, the better you are in terms of preparation. So let's look at the evaluation process. There are a couple things the interviewer will do, typically at FAANG companies when they're evaluating candidates' interview performance. So they'll have a rubric, a template that they need to fill out. And these contain question, summary, assessment, grading rubric, and a hiring decision. So they'll have some list of questions that they're going to ask during the interviews or some follow-up questions that they've asked. And then they'll summarize in their own words in terms of what the candidate have said. And then they'll have some assessment in terms of what the candidate said right and what the candidate said wrong in each of the response that they have, in each of the response that the candidate has provided. And then they'll have a grading rubric. So typically in an interview, there might be 2 to 3 attributes that they're assessing on, and then there are some ratings and some Likert scale. You know, it could be 1 to 4, 1 to 5, 1 to 6, and it really depends on the company by company cases. And then they'll have basically just an overview of, okay, given that this is a statistics round, we're going to test the candidate's data intuition, statistics, and communication. And then there's a Likert scale of 1 through 5 in terms of how strongly candidate perform in each of the attribute, along with some justification on how why this candidate deserved this rating. And then the final part is basically something for the hiring committee. So they'll provide basically a final recommendation. So based on the candidate's response, the assessment, the grading rubric, what is the final decision in terms of whether this candidate is a strong hire or a weak hire. And they'll provide this paragraph basically to a separate entity that will oversee whether a candidate should be hired or not at the end of the interview process beyond the on-site rounds. The next thing I want to cover is the assessment part itself. So in terms of how an interviewer will take your response and assess it, and I just want to let you know that it somewhat depends on the interview cases, and it depends on the round, the company, but in general, there are some characteristics that the interviewer is assessing when they're looking at a candidate's response. So there are 5 properties. So there's structure, completeness, soundness, clarity, and speed. Let's go over each of the elements here. So the very first thing that an interviewer might look at is, overall, did you provide a structured response or not? Or did you end up rambling? So this is where the framework that I've provided can be really helpful in terms of turning a vague problem into a very structured problem. And then, was your solution complete? So did you cover only a portion of it, but you didn't actually complete the problem end to end? What was the soundness of the methodology that you have proposed? Was it logical? Did it make sense? Did it have the right data intuition when you're solving these type of problems? Were you clear? So clarity is very important. When you're communicating, did the interviewer understand what you're saying? And then lastly, what was your speed? So did you have a lot of ums, and did you have a lot of, were you lost, halfway through this case problem? And then maybe at the very end, you ended up providing a response, but that wasn't as good. So another thing is, basically the interviewer is looking for is the speed at which you're able to come up with a response, come up with an actual solution that can be really helpful. So the next thing I want to talk about is how you prepare. Having an effective strategy is going to be really important as you're getting ready for the data science case interviews. So let's look at a couple tips. There are 3 tips I want to share, which are research, self-practice, and mock interviews. Let's look through how you actually apply this preparation tip comprehensively. The very first thing that you probably want to do is you want to research. So if you have an interview lined up, do you understand the company, the team, and the role that you're interviewing for? And the more you can extract specific information about these attributes, the better you are in terms of providing effective response in case interviews. Because case interviews, as I mentioned, are business specific. So the type of questions that you may want to research up front are something like, what is the mission statement of the company? What is the business model? What are the flagship products and services? Who are the main users? What is the main company's vision over the next couple of years? What is the UI, UX elements of its core products? So these are the type of questions that are going to be helpful as you're doing the research. The next thing is you want to self-practice. And this is something I personally use quite a lot as I was preparing for data scientist interviews at Google, Lyft, LinkedIn, Facebook, and so forth. And so how do you practice these case interviews? There are 4 steps that can be really helpful. So the very first thing is you want to find a case problem, and there are a couple resources out there that can be helpful. And one of those resources is basically the website datainterview.com, where there are 40 case problems asked by FANG companies, and you can use this as a way to practice your case responses. The second thing is once you have found your target case practice problem, you want to ideate a solution. And so take the time to, on a Word document on a sheet of paper or whiteboard, basically flesh out your initial thoughts about how you might approach this problem. And then the third step is explaining out loud. Now this step can be very awkward at first because you're somewhat talking to yourself, but it can be really helpful because it helps you practice impromptu speaking. Because at the end of the day, when you're doing the case interview, even if you might have some idea in terms of how you're going to approach this, if you can't explain it well, then you're going to be penalized greatly especially in the communication attribute on the grading rubric. So make sure you do take some time to practice. And so what that could mean is that, time yourself for 5 minutes, and with the outline that you have created on a sheet of paper, just explain your solution out loud. And it's okay if you need some multiple takes to try to explain it. And then the last part is self-assess. So after you have provided your response, think about it in terms of how were the structure, the completeness, soundness, clarity, and speed at which you provided a response. Because this is going to be helpful in terms of coming up with, what are your strengths and weaknesses that you can certainly improve in order to provide an effective case response. The next tip I want to cover is mock interviews. You definitely want to leverage mock interviews as much as you can because one, it helps you reduce the anxiety you have when you're doing impromptu speaking in front of other people. And secondly, you're training your impromptu skills. Being able to think on your feet is a skill set. And the more you're in these situations, the better you are in terms of acing the case interviews in data science. So there are 2 resources that you can definitely leverage. And you can have a mock interview session with me. I conduct mock interviews as a coach. And so if you're interested, you can definitely check out datainterview.com. Basically, it's a 60-minute session, and the question itself is about 30 to 40 minutes, and it's based on the phone screening and on-site rounds at FANG companies. And at the end of it, I provide some comprehensive feedbacks and some recommendations that are going to be helpful in terms of your preparation. And then the second type of resource that you can definitely leverage is the Slack community. So when you enroll as a subscriber to the datainterview.com, then you become enrolled in the Slack community where you can find practice buddies for mock interviews. The last part of this video is an interactive exercise. This is an opportunity for you to actually practice a case problem. And the case problem is actually the one that was asked in a phone screening and Lyft interview. In order to use this video effectively, please follow this instruction. So first of all, I'll have an opening question. I would pause the video and try to apply the framework that I mentioned. And then resume the video about a minute or 2 minutes later, and then look at what the candidate response says. There are going to be a series of follow-up questions, and for each of the follow-up questions, pause the video and then think about what your response can be. So the opening question is the following. How would you measure driver satisfaction on Lyft? Pause the video and take some time to think about how you would approach this. The very first thing that you want to do is you want to clarify the question. So as a candidate, you could ask the following questions. What is the business purpose of measuring driver satisfaction? What is the meaning of satisfaction in this case? Are there labels available from surveys? Keep in mind that this question is somewhat vague from the get-go. What does satisfaction actually mean? It's a qualitative definition. These are the type of questions that you can definitely ask to try to frame basically a parameter around this opening question. Now suppose that the interviewer followed up by saying, you will need to discern how the satisfaction measure will be used and what it means. Lastly, suppose that you do not have labels. What would you do? Pause the video for a minute or 2 and then resume. The next thing that you want to do is you want to try to constrain it. Basically, you want to parameterize what the business objectives should be. And you can start by bringing up some business context. So you can say something along the lines of, I can tell Lyft cares about its drivers because you want to keep the drivers content and encourage them to keep driving on the platform. If the satisfaction goes down, drivers turn. If drivers turn, prices go up, given the lack of drivers available. If prices go up, riders are less likely to use the service. Ultimately, this feedback loop could hurt Lyft's business model. Now, suppose that the interviewer followed up by saying, Okay, now how would you measure the satisfaction among drivers? Take a minute or two and think about the response. Now, this is the part where you could just request an interviewer that, hey, you need a quick little pause to come up with your own response. So you can say, I'd like to take a minute or two to gather my thoughts on a solution if that's okay with you. And once you're ready, you have some general framework in terms of how you're going to approach it. You can say something on the lines of, to address this, I'd like to first define a proxy for satisfaction, then provide a modeling approach to measure satisfaction per driver. Finally, I'll conclude with how this could be useful for Lyft. So notice the three main steps that the candidate highlights here. The very first thing is defining what satisfaction means. The second thing is how this is going to be measured. And the very last thing is essentially how this could be useful or impactful for Lyft. Now let's look at the next follow-up question from the interviewer. The interviewer says, sounds good. Now can you explain your process? Take a minute or two and think about how you would provide this response. Now the next step is to provide your methodology. How would you solve this problem? An example response could be the following. Given that the survey isn't an option, we need to identify an observable behavior that serves as a proxy for satisfaction. I suppose that the closest proxy could be churn. If a driver is unsatisfied with the platform, they will leave. We can track the churn behavior among drivers and perform segmentation to identify types of drivers that are more likely to churn or not. A simple way to do this is to build a logistic regression model with features such as driver profile, engagement, geo, and such. So essentially, the candidate first links a satisfaction to a proxy behavior. In this case, it's going to be churn. And the reason why you may want to use a proxy label is because as the interviewer mentioned, you cannot really use a survey. So you need to think about what could be the closest behavior to something that represents satisfaction in this case, and in this case, it's going to be churn. And then from there, you want to try to understand the churn behavior much more, so at a more granular level. So are there type of subgroups based on the type of drivers, the geography, where the drivers are churning more, meaning they're dissatisfied with the platform. And so this is where using a logistic regression model can be really helpful. Here's the last follow-up question. Suppose that the interviewer asks, how would you use the satisfaction measure to help Lyft? Take a minute or two and think about your response. The last step is to conclude it. So this is where you tie your methodology I proposed back to the business problem. So you can conclude it by saying something on the lines of this. An intervention could be useful to improve satisfaction. Here's what I mean. If a subgroup of drivers is more likely to churn, a proxy for dissatisfaction, perhaps they could be incentivized to stay longer on the platform with a ride bonus or phone call from Lyft's support team that addresses any concerns that the drivers may have. This added attention could encourage satisfaction among drivers and get them to provide more rides. So here's an example where the candidate understands that you're not just measuring satisfaction for the sake of measuring. There's a purpose behind this. In this case, you want to improve the satisfaction among drivers. And how you can do this is first of all identifying basically types of behaviors that a driver might display if they're dissatisfied, or it's a low satisfaction. In this case, the behavior is going to be churn. And so you target a subgroup of users that are more likely to churn because they're dissatisfied. And then you can try to provide some intervention, basically in the form of some bonus credit or in the form of like a phone call that addresses any of the concerns that they may have. And when you do that, when you apply this intervention, the hope is that you can improve the satisfaction among drivers and ultimately reduce the churn. I enjoyed providing this tutorial about how to ace the data scientist case interviews. Hope you liked it. Please hit the like button and make sure you check out datainterview.com for more prep materials.